In the week that passed, the world witnessed a massive transformation in the Middle East. The regime of Bashar al-Assad, which had ruled Syria with an iron fist for years, finally fell. But what people didn't know was that the fall of this regime was only the beginning of a nightmare that was about to cast its shadow over the land of Sham. Behind the scenes of power, there were secrets that even those closest to Bashar al-Assad were unaware of. Ancient spells that had been kept hidden for centuries and used by the government to control the people. But with the collapse of the regime, these spells went out of control and opened a gateway to a world of darkness and horror. This story is an account of the 7 days following the fall. 7 days that turned Syria into a hell on earth. The sound of the morning call to prayer rose from the minarets of Damascus, but this time with a different resonance. Ammar, the muezzin of the Umayyad mosque, felt his voice trembling. Something in the air had changed, as if the darkness was more tangible than ever. Ammar came down from the minaret, and in the mosque's courtyard, he encountered a sight that froze the blood in his veins. The central fountain, which was always filled with clear water, was now full of a thick, black liquid that reeked of decay. "Ya Allah," Ammar whispered under his breath and stepped back. Suddenly, a scream was heard from inside the mosque. He ran fearfully towards the door and opened it. In the mosque's mihrab, the lifeless body of the Imam, Sheikh Farouk, lay on the ground. But this wasn't the only strange thing. Sheikh Farouk's body was unnaturally twisted, as if his bones had melted. Ammar ran out of the mosque in horror and shouted, "Help! Help!" But the streets of Damascus were empty. There was no sign of people or cars. The only sound was the howling of the wind, which seemed to be letting out a mournful wail. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Layla, a young Damascus girl, woke up with a start. She felt something crawling on her face. In panic, she ran her hand over her face and realized it was covered with small and large bumps. Layla rushed to the mirror and let out a scream from the depths of her soul when she saw her reflection. Her face was covered with festering wounds that were growing larger by the moment. "Mom! Dad!" Layla called out tearfully, but received no answer. She fearfully left her room and headed towards her parents' room. When she opened the door, she was confronted with a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her parents were lying on the bed, but their bodies had turned completely black, as if they had been burned. And from their eyes, a thick, black liquid was flowing. Layla backed away in horror and ran out of the house. But the streets weren't safe either. The sky had turned blood red, and the black clouds had taken on strange shapes. In a corner of the street, she saw a man lying on the ground, writhing. When she got closer, she saw that the man's skin was peeling off, and underneath it, something like a snake was emerging. Layla started running with all her might, but everywhere she went, she encountered more horrifying scenes. People suspended in midair, trees dripping blood, and shadows that moved and took on human forms. Meanwhile, in the now abandoned presidential palace, something strange was happening in Bashar al-Assad's secret room. An ancient book lay on the table, its pages turning by themselves, emitting a green light. This book was the source of all the spells that the government had used for years. And now, with no one to control it, its power was being released. As night fell, the situation worsened. Strange howls could be heard from every corner of the city, and giant shadows moved across the walls. Some people who were still alive had taken refuge in their homes and locked their doors tightly. But they knew this was only the beginning of a nightmare that was about to rule over Syria. On the morning of the second day, the sun didn't rise. The sky of Damascus was covered with black, dense clouds that absorbed the light. The city was plunged into absolute darkness, and the only light came from flames that flickered here and there. Yasmin, a young nurse at Al-Shami Hospital, fearfully left her house. She knew that in these conditions the hospital needed her, but what she saw in the streets terrified her. Bodies of people were lying on the ground, but these bodies were moving. They twitched irregularly like puppets and emitted moaning sounds. Yasmin carefully passed by these moving corpses and headed towards the hospital. But when she got there, she encountered a scene she would never forget. The hospital doors had been torn off their hinges and were lying on the ground. Screams and shouts could be heard from inside the building. Yasmin entered fearfully and saw that the patients had left their beds and were wandering the corridors. If you enjoyed it so far, please hit the subscribe button if you liked the video. But these weren't ordinary patients. Their eyes had turned white, and their skin had turned gray. They moved like zombies and attacked anything in their path. Yasmin backed away in horror and wanted to leave the hospital, but the exit was blocked. She was forced to go upstairs and take refuge in one of the rooms. Meanwhile, in the city center, a group of people had gathered in the Umayyad Mosque. They hoped that in this sacred place, they would be safe from the demonic forces. But suddenly, a roaring sound was heard from underground. The ground began to shake, and deep cracks appeared in the mosque floor. From these cracks, black smoke emerged that took the shape of strange creatures. These creatures, which looked like moving shadows, rushed towards the people. Anyone touched by these shadows instantly froze and turned into a stone statue. In another part of the city, Farid, a young Syrian engineer, had taken refuge in his house. He was trying to communicate with the outside world via the internet, but all communication networks were down. Suddenly, his computer screen started flickering, and strange images appeared on it. These images were ancient maps showing the burial sites of powerful spells. Farid stared at these maps curiously and realized that one of these locations was right under his house. He hesitantly went to the basement of the house and started digging. After hours of digging, he reached a metal box covered with strange symbols. When he opened the box, a blinding light came out, and Farid felt his body changing. At that moment, in the sky over Damascus, the clouds took the shape of a giant face. This face, which bore an uncanny resemblance to Bashar al-Assad, began to laugh. The sound of its laughter echoed like thunder throughout the city, shaking the remaining windows. People stared at the sky in terror. The eyes of the cloudy face turned blood red, and from them, drops of blood began to rain down. Each drop that reached the ground transformed into a small, demonic creature that quickly scurried towards the people. Farid, still in his house's basement, felt his body changing. His skin began to crack, and from the fissures, a green light emanated. He screamed in pain, but his voice gradually transformed into a growl, reminiscent of wild animals. In the streets, Yasmin, who had escaped from the hospital window, was trying to save herself from the clutches of vampire-like creatures. She ran towards the Umayyad Mosque, hoping to find sanctuary there. But when she arrived, she was confronted with a horrifying scene. The mosque, once a sacred place, had now become a gateway to the spirit world. A black light shone from the mihrab, and the spirits of the dead were emerging from it. These spirits, with their distorted and painful faces, moved towards Yasmin. Meanwhile, Samir, still trapped in the building, noticed that the blood on the ground had started to move. The blood, like a living entity, crept towards him and began to climb up his legs. He frantically tried to free himself, but the blood bound him tighter, like a rope. The laughter of Bashar al-Assad in the sky grew louder, and the ground began to shake. Buildings collapsed one after another, and from the rubble emerged strange creatures that were a hybrid of machine and flesh. Fatima, still hidden in her house, looked out the window and saw that the trees had begun to move. Their branches, like bony hands, reached out towards the houses, grabbing anyone in their path and pulling them into their hollow trunks. In the city center, the ancient book of spells that was in the presidential palace began to fly. Its pages turned rapidly, and from each page, a wave of demonic energy was released, further contaminating the city's atmosphere. As night fell, the moon turned blood red, and the stars went out one by one. Damascus was plunged into absolute darkness, the only light coming from fires that flickered here and there, and from the glowing eyes of demonic creatures lurking in the shadows. The screams and cries of people mingled with the howling wind and the roar of thunder. The city of Damascus, once renowned for its beauty and history, had now been transformed into a hell on earth. And this was just the beginning of a nightmare that was set to last for 7 days. On the morning of the third day, it started to rain, but this wasn't ordinary rain. Red, thick drops fell from the sky, covering the ground with a layer of blood. The smell of decay and iron filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. Samir, a former police officer, came out of his underground shelter to assess the situation. He felt nauseous at the sight of the blood-soaked streets. Suddenly, a scream was heard from the adjacent building. Samir cautiously entered the building and was confronted with a horrifying scene. A young woman was lying on the ground, and her body was melting. Her skin was melting like wax, and underneath it, something like a snake was emerging. Samir wanted to run away, but his feet were stuck to the ground. He realized in horror that the blood rain was acting like glue, holding him in place. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Yasmin was still taking refuge in her room. The moans and screams of the zombified patients could be heard from the corridor. Suddenly, the door burst open loudly, and Dr. Ahmed, the hospital director, entered. Yasmin felt relieved at the sight of him, but this feeling didn't last long. Dr. Ahmed, with red eyes and a mouth stretched to his ears, attacked her. Yasmin jumped out of the window with a scream and fell onto the blood-soaked ground. On the fourth day, the sky had turned a poisonous green color, and the smell of sulfur permeated everything. Terrified people had taken refuge in their homes, but even the walls weren't safe. Fatima, a Syrian teenage girl, was sitting in her room trying to calm herself. Suddenly, the images on her room wall came to life. Family photos started moving, and the people in them came out of the frames. These ghosts, which looked like spectral versions of Fatima's family members, stared at her with empty eyes and started talking. They spoke of betrayals, lies, and past sins, accusing Fatima. Fatima tried to escape the room in tears, but the door was locked. The ghosts came closer and closer, extending their cold, lifeless hands towards her. On the fifth day, the ground began to shake. Deep cracks appeared in the streets, and from within them, flames shot up. The Umayyad Square, once the beating heart of Damascus, had now turned into a gateway to hell. Horrifying creatures emerged from this gateway, looking like a combination of human and animal. With sharp claws claws and fangs, they attacked anything in their path. Omar, the priest of the old Damascus church, tried to ward off these creatures with prayer and holy water. But when he sprinkled holy water on them, it turned to blood, and the creatures grew stronger. On the 6th day, the air was filled with black particles that swirled like dust. Anyone who inhaled these particles lost control of their mind. Mariam, a school teacher, saw her students succumbing to these particles one by one. Their eyes turned black, and they started performing horrific acts. With demonic laughter, they began torturing each other. Mariam tried to stop them, but she too gradually felt her mind being possessed. With her last ounce of strength, she locked herself in the school closet and hoped this nightmare would end. On the 7th day, the sky split open and giant creatures emerged from it. These creatures, resembling angels of death with black wings and fiery swords, flew over the city. The sound of a trumpet echoed in the sky, and the ground began to collapse. Buildings crumbled like paper houses, and people screamed as they tried to escape. Amidst this chaos, Farid, now transformed into a half-human, half-demon creature, emerged from his house's basement. He held a spell that could return everything to normal. With great effort, Farid made his way to the main square of the city. He raised the spell and began reciting an ancient incantation. A blinding light engulfed everything, and for a moment, everything stopped. When the light faded, Damascus had returned to normal. The streets were clean, the sky was blue, and people looked around in confusion. But was everything really over? Farid looked at his hands and realized that traces of demonic changes still remained in him. He knew this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of a new era of horror. In a corner of the city, the ancient book of spells was still open, its pages turning in the wind, waiting for someone to read it again and restart the nightmare.